So now it's time to talk about how the column sizes actually work. So think of it in terms of widths, not necessarily heights. So it doesn't really matter how tall it is in some cases, but it's more about how wide it is. And that's really what we're concerned with, because it's also more true for the browser size itself, right? So if you're on a mobile device, it's going to be not very wide. If you're on a desktop, it will be pretty wide. So that's where the columns really shine, is understanding the context between those two things. But before we understand it with different browser sizes, let's just look at these column sizes and see how they work. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to create a new container and row above all of this stuff. So I'm just going to say div class equals to container. And of course, you could use container fluid here too to see that, but we're just going to stick with the regular div class of container. And then we'll do div class of row, because columns have to be inside of rows to work properly. And then I'm just going to go ahead and copy that very first one. And what I'm going to do, instead of having it at 1, I'm just going to call it column. We save that and we refresh in here. And what it does is it takes the entire 12 columns. So saying just column in this case is very similar to saying column 12. That's true until I add another column. So if I added another column in here and said like column 8, what size will this column likely take? What number would go in here? Remember, 12 is the magic number. So what's 12 minus 8? That's what you hopefully are thinking. So if I refresh in here, I now see that, look, this is 4 columns across and this is 8. So that's what this is showing me down here. So again, I can actually explicitly write that, which in many cases you will explicitly write it, because in many cases you want to know for sure that's the distribution, right? 12 and 8. And this is true no matter what the size of the browser is. It's a little bit more evident by looking below here, what's going on. And that's, I mean, even that is still a little challenging because there's a gap here. There's still going to be a gutter there. But when we make it a little bit bigger, it kind of shows us how these columns are working. So if I change the height on these, so I'll just say style, minimum height being 800 pixels on both of these. Well, let's do it on only one for a second. We see that this row or this column is going to be that minimum height, right? So that's the same if I put it into the alert itself. It shows me that this column is that height. And if I look at the column on the left of it, it is also that height. So it's making that entire row that height. So we're already starting to see the basis of any given website, right? So let's go ahead and just add another row above here with the same stuff. So I'm just copying and pasting here, but I'll just add a column 12, and then we'll do an alert secondary, and we'll just call this navigation, or just nav, right? So I'm already starting to see the basis of a site. I have the navigation bar up top. I have a sidebar, or potentially a sidebar, and main content area, and even a footer down here, right? So the structure is there. Now, if I break it down, it's showing me that same structure. So this is really good for all sorts of things, but you definitely want to play around with these numbers, right? So you might want this to be 2 and this to be 10. And when we see that, we see much bigger. So I have one left sidebar. What if I wanted a right sidebar? Well, let's bring this back to being 8. And what do you know? We add another column small 2, or column 2. So a column of size 2. And there you go. So again, it breaks it down however we'd like. And I can add that minimum height to these other alerts so we can really see it. And now you see that these are all broken down just a little bit differently than your standard site might be. And again, it does have these gutters. So if we inspect the element here and we look at any given column, I see that there is this green line around it. And if I go into these computed styles, I see that the padding is 15. And that's what's called a gutter. So we can actually get rid of those gutters by going into our row itself and say no dash gutters, save that, and refresh in here. And what do you know? The padding on the actual column goes away. So this puts our nav right next to each other, or I mean our little alerts right next to each other if you wanted that. Now, of course, the alerts themselves have stuff in there. So if I just put a paragraph tag in here and said hello world, we'll see the difference coming through. See how the hello world is right on the line there where the alert is still indented a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that for now. That is having your column sizes. Now, there are so many other things that you can do with this, but I want you to play around with it now to see and understand how these sizes work. And the next one, we'll talk about how you can offset these things and really put the columns in different places as you may see fit.